Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, state, defense, and Mr. McIver. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Clark Palmer. We just spent, I think, maybe 30 or 40 minutes listening to the state tell you all their theories and their reasons why they think Mr. McIver intentionally shot Diane McIver. And I want to tell you that you can just set all of that aside. There's really one thing that you need to know about Tex McIver and Diane McIver to know that he did not intentionally shoot his wife, and that is that he loved her, truly loved her, deeply loved her, and she loved him back. You are going to hear from multiple witnesses that they had a relationship that people were envious of, that they seemed like lovebirds even after 10 years of marriage, that Tex adored Diane, that she loved him, and that they were clearly proud to be married to each other. And that's why he didn't intentionally shoot her. Okay, so there are some facts that we don't dispute in this case. Actually, maybe quite a few. One fact you are not going to have to decide is, did Tex shoot Diane? Yes, he did. We are not telling you that the gun was sitting on the seat next to him and it accidentally went off. We are not telling you that the gun malfunctioned. No one is going to ask you to decide who was holding the gun when it went off. It was Tex. That's not a dispute, so don't worry about that. The question you have to decide, was it intentional? And the evidence is going to show it was not. Nothing the state will present to you will prove that this was not an accident. So let me start by kind of going through the timeline of September 25th. And again, this is an area where probably we don't have a lot of disagreement with the state. Danny Joe Carter and Diane and Tex drove out to their ranch in Eatonton, Georgia, which is near Lake Oconee. On Friday, September 23rd, they all went out there together. They had a wonderful weekend. They had great weather. On the afternoon, the day in the afternoon of Sunday, September 25th, Tex and Diane played golf. They had a great round of golf. I think Diane beat Tex. She was an excellent golfer. Danny Joe was riding horses. And after they got done playing golf, it was kind of in the late afternoon, evening, and that was when it was time to head back to Atlanta. So they leave the ranch, they stop off at the Longhorn in Conyers, where they meet Craig Stringer, who is a co-worker or colleague of Diane. I believe he had also been playing golf with them earlier that day. He meets them at the Longhorn restaurant, where, yes, they share dinner, and by the time they leave, I think you'll hear that it was maybe approximately 8:30 at night on Sunday when they left. So they start driving back to Atlanta. The state showed you part of the route that they used to drive back to Atlanta. Again, a fact that's not in dispute. They go on I-20, and when they get to the connector, they hit a traffic jam. There was some construction going on the interstate, so traffic was really backed up. At this point in time, Tex has fallen asleep in the backseat of the car. He fell asleep on the ride from Longhorn into the city. And so Diane is the one who tells Danny Joe to get off the interstate. Diane is familiar with that area down there. She knows how to use the surface streets to get from the Edgewood exit area back up to their condo in Buckhead. So she is giving Danny Joe the directions. They get off at the Edgewood exit, as I say, and at that point in time, Tex wakes up and he looks around. He says, "Girls, I think this is a bad idea," or "I think this is a bad area," something like that. And he says something to the effect of, "Darling, why don't you hand me my gun?" And as the state said, Diane reaches into the center console. The gun is already in the plastic bag. Mr. McIver doesn't put the gun in the bag. That's how it was stored in the vehicle. It was stored that way to sort of disguise it in case somebody broke into the car. The thief wouldn't realize that it was a gun, hopefully, and take it. So it was already in the plastic bag. That's how it was stored in the car. Mrs. McIver passes it back to him. He puts it, he's in the back seat of the car. He's kind of, sitting back there, puts the gun in his lap. He's, maybe slumped down a little bit. And as they start to drive and keep going, he dozes back out and falls back asleep. Now, when Diane McIver and Danny Joe pass the gun back, they don't object. They don't say, Tex, what are you talking about? You don't need your gun. What do you need that for? They just hand it back to him. No questions asked. So when they get up to the area of Piedmont Park, as the state said, the gun discharges. At that point in time, and I'll get to this a little bit later in more detail, the gun is in Tex's lap, okay? It's kind of laying sideways in his lap. Like this, he's falling asleep. When they get by Piedmont Park, the gun just discharges and goes off. And it takes a second for Danny, Joe, and Diane to realize what has happened. I think Danny Joe, I expect that she'll tell you, at first she thought maybe somebody hit them in the car. She wasn't exactly sure what the sound was. And Diane says, Tex, what did you do? And then a few seconds later, maybe even close to a minute later, it was a traumatic situation. Nobody had a stopwatch. So all these estimates of what happened when are really people just kind of reaching back in their memory during the trying to say, here's my best recollection of what I think happened. But some time passed, again, seconds, maybe up to a minute, and Diane starts to kind of, I don't know about writhe in pain. I believe that what Danny Joe said is that she kind of starts to slump over, and she kind of starts to lose consciousness. And so Tex is in the back seat, and he reaches forward, and he wraps his arms around Diane. He's holding her head in his hands, talking to her, trying to kind of figure out what's going on. She's shot, as the state says, she's shot in her kind of mid to lower back. There's not a lot of blood. It's not, kind of immediately apparent what her injuries are. There's not, kind of blood pouring out everywhere. You're going to see pictures of what the inside of the SUV looks like. You're going to see pictures of what Mrs. McIver looked like at that time. You'll see that there's just very little blood. So they're trying to figure out what happened, how serious this injury is. And Danny Joe says to Tex, where should I go? Maybe she was thinking that Piedmont Hospital was closer, but she never said to Tex, how do I get to Piedmont? We should go to Piedmont. What she says is, where should I go? And Tex tells her to go to Emory Hospital. He's very familiar with Emory Hospital. He had been there recently for some procedure or surgery, and he knows how to get from the Piedmont Park area up to Emory Hospital. So he starts giving her directions as they're going. They rush to Emory Hospital. Danny Joe is driving as fast as she can. It's important to get there quickly, obviously. It's also important to get there, safely, so they don't have a wreck and slow themselves down even further. Nobody is going to come in here and tell you what Mrs. McIver was thinking at that time. Nobody is going to be able to tell you why she said what she said. But what she says to Dr. Hardy, without any prompting, is it was an accident. Dr. Hardy doesn't ask her, do you think it was an accident? Do you think he did it on purpose? She offers, it was an accident. So the state mentioned to you in their opening the fact that nobody called 911. And that's true. Again, that's another undisputed fact. Danny Joe was driving the car. If she thought to call 911, she didn't tell Tex, hey, my phone is back there, why don't you call 911? Tex didn't call 911, he was giving the turn-by-turn directions to Emory. I don't think you should draw any inference or conclusion from the fact that they didn't call 911. The facts are going to show that they got to the hospital, that Tex knew how to get to as quickly as they could. And what Diane said to Dr. Hardy is exactly what happened. This was a horrible, horrible accident. So that's September 25th. In the days after September 25th, Tex McIver actually calls the Atlanta police and says, I understand you want to speak with me. I'll come down and make a statement. And he goes down with Steve Maples, which name you heard. That's the lawyer who was representing him at that time. And he talks to Detective Darren Smith. And let me pause here and just address one thing that the state mentioned in their opening. They told you that what Tex said to the detectives was, I like to be in control. And I want to put that comment in context for you. The question to Mr. McIver was talking about how to get down to the ranch on Friday. The detectives were asking him, how did you get to the ranch on Friday? The detective says, did you all go down in one vehicle? Tex says, yes, sir. Okay, that was the expedition. Correct. Detective Smith, okay, did you guys take turns driving down there? Or did some of you drive more than others? Mr. McIver said, I think I drove. Detective Smith said, okay, you're like me. I like to drive when I go. Tex says, I like to be in control. That's the context of that statement. He's just talking about when they drove down to the ranch, that was why he was driving. It's not some nefarious statement he made in connection with explaining what happened on September 25th. So that's September 28, 2016. Importantly, Tex McIver tells Detective Smith exactly what happened. He tells them he was holding the gun when it went off. He tells them Danny Joe was driving the car when he went off. The events that I just relayed to you about what happened on September 25th, that is what Tex McIver told the Atlanta Police Department on September 28th. Months later, in December 2016, he is arrested. He is arrested for reckless conduct and involuntary manslaughter. He is not arrested for murder. So let me talk about the forensic and ballistics evidence. Let me talk about what happened when the gun went off, what the trajectory was. Let me talk to you about the gun itself. And again, this is the gun that went off and shot Diane McIver. As the judge explained, it's made safe, so you don't have to worry about it going off now. I can't demonstrate for you what the trigger pull is because of the lock that's through the gun. But what you'll hear about this gun is it kind of has what I would call two modes: single action mode, double action mode. Some of you who are familiar with firearms may know exactly what I'm talking about, but if you don't, there are kind of two ways you can fire this gun. This is the hammer here. I believe that this is called a shrouded hammer. It's not what I was picturing. When I thought of the hammer of the gun, I thought of something maybe kind of like a sort of an old-timey Western movie, where the hammer's sticking up and it's got the little thumb thing that you click back. This is the hammer of the gun right here. You can see it in the back there. And as I said, it's shrouded, so it's kind of hard to see from the side when you're looking at the gun because it doesn't stick up very far. So if you do not cock the hammer on this gun, you can fire it by pulling the trigger. And as the state told you, it takes about 12 pounds of force to pull the trigger when it is in double action mode. When you cock the hammer on the gun and it's in single action mode, it only takes 2 pounds of force, which is almost a hair trigger. It is getting, that amount of force is so low, it is almost to the point where they can't measure it because it's so light. So the gun can go off very easily when it is in single action mode. There's no way to forensically tell you if the gun was in single action mode or double action mode when it was discharged. No expert can come in here and say, yes, I've examined the gun. I can tell you when it was last fired that the hammer was cocked or not cocked. And again, I want to be clear that The evidence will not show that the gun went off magically or by itself. It was in Tex's lap, in his hand, when it was discharged. And when we say accidental, what we mean is that the shooting wasn't intentional. And I think there are kind of 5 key takeaways you'll see from the forensic evidence that will show to you that this was not intentional. First, as I said, the gun was resting on Tex's lap when it was discharged. Second, it was fired from a sideways position. That's what I was demonstrating for you before, that when Tex was kind of, laid back in the car, sort of slumped down, the gun is in his lap in this sideways position. It's not pointed upright. It's not like this. It's not back by his hip. It is in his lap when it is fired. The gun never comes out of the plastic bag. That is one thing that we can say definitively from the forensic evidence. They can tell that it was fired from within the plastic bag. Fourth, the bullet goes through the seat, and I'm going to show you a slide on that in just a second. And fifth, Diane was shot in her lower back, as I said, mid to lower back, kind of this area back here. So the gun wasn't aimed at Diane. It wasn't pointed, arm outstretched at the back of the seat. It wasn't aimed higher up her back, where you would expect somebody to aim the gun if they intentionally wanted to kill somebody. It wasn't pointed at any of her vital organs up here, her heart or her lungs. It wasn't pointed at her head through the back of the seat. In other words, all these facts show that the discharge of the gun was not intentional, but was accidental. So we looked at the gun already. So here is what's shown in these pictures is the passenger seat of the Expedition. This picture in the bottom left corner with the number 2 on it, that's the back of the seat. You can see that that's where the bullet entered the seat. This picture over here on the right, and I hope you all can see it, shows you that there's a lot of kind of mechanical workings on the inside of the seat. I think those relate to maybe the seat heater or maybe the motorized seat. I don't know. But the point is that this bullet passed through all of that before it came out of the front of the seat, which is that top left corner where the number 3 is. And I'm not trying to be crass or glib about this shooting, but if you were going to intentionally shoot someone because you wanted to kill them, this is
objection, Your Honor. Argument.
So if you want to share what you think the evidence will show, you're welcome to do that. And then at the end of the proceedings, you're welcome to say, based on this, I think it's shown or failed to show X, Y, or Z.
The evidence is going to show to you that it would be just as likely that this bullet might strike the mechanical workings of the interior of the seat and deflect. Maybe come back and hit Mr. McIver. Maybe go through the seat but deflect and go off at a different angle, go through the radio, go through the side of the car. The evidence is going to show you that it is not a guarantee or even likely that you would be able to kill somebody in this method. And that's why the shooting was accidental and not intentional. Most importantly, there was a witness who was Diane McIver's best friend. Danny Jo Carter had known Diane McIver for a long time before Tex McIver met Diane. The evidence will show that it's inconsistent with an intentional killing to shoot Mrs. McIver in front of her best friend. You are also going to hear evidence that Tex has a sleeping disorder. It's called Rem Behavior Disorder. It is abbreviated as RBD. So most of us, when we fall asleep and when we dream, kind of a curtain comes down in our mind. So that if we're dreaming that we're running or jumping or whatever, our body is not physically acting out what we're doing in our dreams. People who have Rem Behavior Disorder do experience physical movement while they're dreaming. They can jab and kick if somebody else happens to be in bed with them, because they have whole body jerks. They can have whole body jerks when they're experiencing a dream and they have Rem Behavior Disorder. Mr. McIver has a well-documented history, going back more than a decade, of having Rem Behavior Disorder. And I expect that you will hear evidence about that. I expect you will also hear about something called confusional arousals. And I'm not going to get too far into the details of that with you, but confusional arousals are also sometimes referred to as sleep drunkenness. It's when somebody is startled awake and they are disoriented as to where they are, and they act in a way that doesn't make sense or is inappropriate, maybe even violent. And most importantly, when somebody has experienced a confusional arousal, they can have amnesia, which means they may not be able to recall what exactly happened when they were woken up from their sleep. So I expect that you will hear evidence about that. So let's talk about finances, because the state spent quite a while talking to you about the finances of Mr. McIver and Mrs. McIver. So Tex is 75 years old today. He was, for a very long time, a lawyer and a partner at Fisher & Phillips. It was always part of the plan as he was getting older that he would retire. And it was also something that happened to him, which happens to many, maybe most lawyers as they get older and they start to slow down in their work, that he switched from something called an equity partner to an income partner. I don't remember exactly the date when that happened, but it was sometime in the years before 2016. So kind of the important takeaway from that is equity partner means generally you're making more. Income partner means you're still making a good salary, but you're not making as much as when you were an equity partner. And so I expect that you are going to hear from witnesses from Fisher & Phillips that it is very normal and usual as lawyers advance in their career and they start to get towards retirement age, that they start to slow down, that they change from an equity partner to an income partner, and eventually retire. I also expect that you will hear that Tex remained an equity partner for much longer in his career than most attorneys usually do. At the time he announced his retirement, which was in 2016, so it's not that he lost his job at the firm or he lost some status at the firm. This was part of a plan of his to retire as he got into his 70s. That he still had a big book of business, which essentially means that he had clients who were sending their business to the firm, generating quite a bit of money for the firm. Those clients were very loyal to him, and this was in 2016. So Tex planned to retire from his firm. We absolutely agree that Diane was making more money than Tex. I think the evidence will show you that as his income was kind of going down over the years, that hers was either staying the same or going up. And yes, he was relying on her income every month, in part. She was contributing to expenses at the ranch. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ranch in a second. I think the evidence will show that it is inconsistent for Tex to want to cut off that flow of income from Diane McIver, because that was something that they had planned for. And the plan was that they were going to pay off the debts so that as Tex got into retirement and he no longer had that income from his law firm, they wouldn't have any debts to pay and they could live off of that retirement income they had planned for. So before I talk about the ranch, let me kind of tell you briefly about Tex and Diane's relationship. They met in about 2000. They dated for about 5 years before they got married. They both had been divorced before, and the divorces were not amicable. And by the time they got married, they were both older. They were both well established in their careers. They were both financially secure. So when they got married in 2005, the way that they chose to handle their finances was by keeping things separate. And as the state told you, Diane McIver paid for certain expenses, usually the ones related up to the condo in Atlanta. And Mr. McIver had things that he paid for. Doesn't mean that they didn't kind of jointly contribute to things that involved both of them. Mr. McIver had owned the property out in Eatonton before he met Diane. But when he met Diane, right before they got married, she came to love the ranch too. That's what they called it, the ranch. And so she contributed financially to making improvements on the ranch before they got married and after they got married. For example, after they got married, she liked to have the flowers changed out twice a year. So that's something that she would use her money to do. And when they got married, Mr. McIver changed the deed on the property so that instead of it being solely in his name, it was now in both their names with rights of survivorship, which meant that if one of them died, the other one would have the deed to the ranch all by themselves. The same was true for Tex. If Tex died, Diane would have the ranch all in her name. If Diane died, Tex would have the ranch all in his name. So in 2011, there is this note that is secured by the ranch for $350,000. Tex made payments on the note. Yeah, we agree that you'll see that the note says it's due in either 2013 or 2014, I can't remember. He didn't pay off the note by that point in time, so they renewed the note. They extended its due date out to 2017. And while they had this document that seems businesslike and rather formalistic, don't forget that these two individuals are in a marriage. It's not as if Diane said to Tex, or was going to say to Tex, oh, you're late on your payments for 2 months. I'm going to foreclose the ranch and take it from you. I mean, they were married. They were in a loving relationship. This was something that they worked through together. And the evidence will show you that in 2014, they agreed to extend the note out a little bit farther. One more thing about the loan on the ranch. The loan on the ranch doesn't go away when Diane dies. There's nothing in the document that says if Diane dies, this debt is forgiven and you don't have to repay it. I expect you will hear the evidence that Tex is still making payments on that loan to this day. We don't dispute that both Diane and Tex were contemplating making changes to their will. They both had a will that was drafted and executed in 2006, which was executed either before Austin was born or it was executed at a time when he had just been born. So he hadn't really, he was in their lives, but they hadn't developed that close connection with him that they both developed as Austin got older. So Austin is their godson. They both loved him dearly. It's not as if Austin was only Diane's godson. Both Diane and Tex treated Austin as if he was their own child. They both loved him dearly. They both wanted to provide for him in the event that either one of them died. This is not something that Diane was contemplating doing all by herself. And that's another reason why Tex would not intentionally shoot Diane, because he knows that Diane loves Austin, and Austin loves Diane dearly, and he would never take her away from him. Let me also address something that the state brought up in their opening, which was this auction that happened after Diane passed away, where her belongings were sold to generate money for the estate. I expect the evidence will be that that was done on the advice of a lawyer named Stan Smith, who I expect he will come tell you that he was the one who said we need to hold the auction of these items and we need to do it now. The reason being, there's kind of two reasons that go along with that. One is that in particular the furs are obviously a winter item. So you are more likely to get more money for the furs if you have the auction when it's cold than if you do it in the middle of the summer. The second is that just kind of generally clothes sort of lose their value over time. So you don't want to hold on to clothes and sell them at the next cold season because they may not generate as much money when they're sold. So I expect that you will hear Stan Smith come tell you those two things, as well as tell you that it was his advice to hold the auction when it was held in I believe, January of 2017. And the auction was held because Diane made specific requests in her will. There were people that she identified that she wanted to receive money, people other than Tex McIver. And the money needed to be raised to satisfy those requests. And I am confident we're going to be diving in to the details of what was in her will, how much money was raised, what was in her bank accounts. So we will have plenty of detail on that as this trial goes on. And while I am on that point, the state's opening spent a lot of time talking about what Mr. McIver did do or didn't do. And I think the evidence will be that there's not some sort of playbook or set of ways that somebody is supposed to act when their spouse has died suddenly and violently, and probably even worse, that your spouse has died at your own hand. I can't imagine anything more traumatic that could happen to an individual. And if there was a certain way that Mr. McIver was supposed to act, well, I don't know where that's written down. So let me move on now. We step away I've been talking a lot about facts that relate to the first 4 counts of the indictment. So let me transition and talk about the last 3, which are the influencing witness counts. The first one deals with Danny Jo Carter. The count charges that Tex told her essentially to tell the police that she was a family friend. The count alleges that he had this conversation with her on September 26th when they were at the hospital. So Danny Jo Carter is given a couple different statements. She is interviewed by the Atlanta Police Department on September 26th, right after the shooting happens. She doesn't say anything to the detectives about Tex telling her to lie. And first of all, just the idea that Tex would tell her, hey, you should tell the police you're just a family friend, doesn't make any sense at all, given that A, they're on camera when they pull up to Emory Hospital. It's clear that Tex is not driving the car. B, it's clear that there's no way Diane could have been shot in the back by Tex unless he was sitting back there and somebody else was driving the car. So it just doesn't make sense that he would go up to Danny Jo and say, hey, why don't you just tell him, you just showed up and you don't know what happened. But on September 26th, I think the evidence is going to show that she is specifically asked by Detective Smith, did you and Tex have a conversation about what to tell the police or what not to tell the police? He's giving her an opening. He wants to know. She says, Tex said he hated for me to be drugged into this mess. She doesn't say anything about Tex telling her to lie or Tex telling her that she's a family friend. When she's interviewed again on September 27th, she doesn't say, hey, by the way, I forgot to tell you something yesterday. Actually, Tex told me, I needed to lie to you all. She doesn't tell her husband that Tex told her to lie. Tom Carter says that Danny Jo said, Tex said, I hate to see you caught up in this, which is consistent with what she told the police on September 26th. It's only much, much later, and I'm not sure if it was weeks or months later, that she tells the DA, oh, Tex told me that I don't lie. So that count fails. You're going to hear this voicemail to Tom Carter. I put the date of October 4th up there. I may have written that wrong, maybe that it was on October 6th. Whatever the date is, you'll hear this short voicemail that he left for Tom Carter. But you've got to put it in context with the timeline of events that had happened. Diane's shot on September 25th. Danny Jo has already been interviewed on September 26th and 27th. Importantly, Tex is interviewed on September 28th. So before he ever calls Tom Carter, he has already gone and told the police that A, he shot Diane, and it was an accident, and B, that Danny Joe was driving. So why on earth would he then call Danny Joe through Tommy Lee, her husband, and say, you need to now change your story? He's already told the police exactly what has happened. And by the way, there is nothing that Danny Joe said to the police that hurts Tex. She tells the police the shooting was an accident. She tells the police that Tex and Diane had a wonderful relationship and she was jealous of it. So why on earth would he call her up and say, now you need to change your story? That count fails. So let me talk about Bill Crane briefly. As the state said, Bill Crane is somebody who was sort of a PR spokesperson for Tex in the kind of days and weeks after Diane died. Bill Crane puts out this statement to the media and says, Tex said that there were Black Lives Matter protesters in the area of Edgewood at that exit, and that's why we got the gun out. This statement was not meant to inject any kind of racial bias or racial animosity into this case, but the press latched onto it, sensationalized it, probably to sell some papers. And so Tex started getting a lot of blowback for the Black Lives Matter comment from the community and from friends. Bill Crane will tell you that he was getting a lot of sort of testy communication from Texas law firm. They were telling him things like, you need to take our name off your web page. So that's the context of this statement. And don't forget that September 26th, what time we're dealing with. On September 23rd, that Friday before Diane died, there was a Black Lives Matter protest at Lenox Mall, right across the street from Tex and Diane's condominium. There had been other reports from all around the country that summer and that year about Black Lives Matter's protests, some of which had gotten violent. But there's two important things to remember about Bill Crane's statement and why this count has got to fail. First, as I said, Bill Crane was the PR spokesperson. There was no reason that Tex would ever think he was interfacing with law enforcement.
Objection, Your Honor.
That's what I think the evidence is going to show.
It's argument, Your Honor.
Okay, I'm just going to remind you to hew to what you think the evidence is going to show rather than arguing whether a count fails.
The evidence is going to show that Bill Crane was not dealing with the Atlanta Police Department, that Tex didn't think Bill Crane was dealing with law enforcement or the DA's office, and that's part of the count, that there's got to be some intent to influence a law enforcement proceeding, and the judge is going to give you instructions. But that's one important thing to remember about that count. The second important thing to remember is that whether or not there were Black Lives Matter protesters has no bearing on the question of whether this was an intentional act. That's the important part of the case. Who was at the exit when they got off doesn't matter. That's the second important thing to remember about this count. It's not a crime, had nothing to do with misleading a witness. So let me finally touch on Jeff Dickerson. Jeff Dickerson comes into the picture kind of later in 2016. Jeff Dickerson is going to tell you that at some point Tex said to him, if you can get the charges dismissed, Tex had been arrested, but there was no indictment at that point in time. But if you can get the charges dismissed or get the DA not to bring an indictment, there's a success fee in it for you. This was not a serious comment. And in fact, it was a stupid comment because it could be easily misinterpreted like it is now. Tex did not mean for Jeff Dickerson to run off and try to bribe Paul Howard. And the evidence is going to show to you that there are a lot of reasons why that's not true. First of all, he doesn't say to Jeff Dickerson, go tell Paul Howard that I'm going to pay you a success fee if you can get the charges dropped, and that you'll share it with Paul Howard. That's not what he says. Second, Tex never followed up with Jeff Dickerson. Hey, have you had that meeting with Paul Howard yet? Did you tell him about the success fee? When are you going to have that meeting? Is something on the calendar yet? None of those conversations ever took place. They never discussed the amount of this supposed success fee. Tex wasn't trying to bribe the DA. He wasn't attempting to commit a crime. Jeff Dickerson, I think the evidence will show, didn't think that Tex actually meant he ought to go bribe the DA, because Jeff Dickerson doesn't go tell Tex's lawyers, hey, you know what, your client just told me that I needed to go commit a crime, that I needed to try to bribe the DA. He doesn't go tell Paul Howard, hey, Tex McIver just tried to get me to commit a crime. He doesn't tell anybody about this conversation until some 14 months later. And, most importantly, Jeff Dickerson doesn't quit working for Tex. He continues to be paid about $3,000 a month. That shows he didn't think Tex was seriously intending that Jeff Dickerson go bribe the DA. This some 14 months later, that Jeff Dickerson is having what appears to be a casual lunch between friends with Paul Howard when he is no longer working for Tex McIver, and somehow this comes up. Why Jeff Dickerson mentions it to Paul Howard, I don't know. The thing I know that the evidence will show is that it was not an intentional statement. It was not a serious attempt to bribe the DA. It was a comment that has been misinterpreted. So finally, let me just wrap up by telling you I think the evidence is going to leave you with some key questions that you're not going to be able to answer. And if you can't answer these questions, you can't conclude that Mr. McIver intentionally shot Diane.
Objection, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I don't understand how this is different from the state's last slide that said you must find him guilty.
Okay.
This argument, all of these questions are argument.
Why don't you just share with the jury what you think the evidence is going to show? You've cast it in the form of questions, and then you can wrap up.
The evidence is going to show that Tex shot Diane accidentally in front of her best friend, and that this is inconsistent with intentionally wanting to shoot and kill Diane. The evidence is going to show that when the gun discharged, they were by Piedmont Park, not somewhere out on I-20, not out in Putnam County, where the ranch is, where it's remote and there's no hospital nearby. The evidence is going to show that the gun was held sideways, that it was shot through the plastic bag, as I said, that it was shot through the car seat, which had all the interior mechanical workings, that the evidence will show the bullet could have been deflected or slowed down or come apart. The evidence is going to show that the gun entered Mrs. McIver's back in her lower to middle back. And then finally, the evidence is going to show that Tex was relying on Diane's substantial cash flow and income every month, and there was no financial reason for him to cut that off. The evidence is going to show to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Tex loved Diane and Diane loved Tex, that she was his best friend, and that he would not intentionally kill her. He did not intentionally kill her. He did not murder her, and he is not guilty. Thank you.